Hi friends, what is the best place to loot on Kings Canyon? I've created a special map showing what tier of loot is in each point of interest on Kings Canyon in Apex Legends, and I'll be referring to this map throughout the video. I actually did a similar video for Olympus. Click the eye icon in the top right of your screen if you want to see that video. But after I made that video, lots of people asked to see a similar kind of map for Kings Canyon. So here it is. You can see all of the hot locations to pick up the best loot on Kings Canyon. The purple areas symbolise high tier loot, the blue areas symbolise mid tier loot, and the grey areas symbolise low tier loot. And this gives you a really great idea of all the different points of interest on Kings Canyon and what tier of loot they have in that area. So you can use this understanding of where the best loot is to help you win more games in Apex Legends. And I'll explain how and why as we go through this video. Now let's start by looking at where the best loot actually is on Kings Canyon. If we look at the map, the purple areas, as I mentioned, indicate high tier loot. And you can see there are nice groupings of high tier loot around Kings Canyon. Particularly around Crash Site, there are some nice groupings there of high tier loot areas. And actually, if you look at it as a whole, much of Kings Canyon has high tier loot around the outside of the map. And then as you look towards the centre of the map, that's where you start seeing more blue and grey tier loot. So actually the best places to loot are actually on the outskirts of Kings Canyon. Interestingly, some areas I used to think were high tier loot aren't actually high tier loot. For example, I always used to think Gauntlet and Airbase were high tier loot areas, but it turns out they're actually just mid tier loot areas. So something to keep in mind as you think about what places you enjoy landing in Kings Canyon. And this applies for pubs, but also ranked as well. Now of course it doesn't mean you don't find good loot in some of these mid tier loot areas. For example, the flaming ring in Octane's Gauntlet usually has a purple or even gold item in the middle. Although I should say occasionally I have seen a blue backpack there, which is kind of a letdown, but now you know the reason why you do sometimes see those blue items in the middle of Octane's ring, and that's because Gauntlet actually is a mid tier loot area. Also another thing to note is that Spotted Lake is no longer a high tier loot area. Of course when Season 8 launched, Spotted Lakes was new and it launched as a high tier loot area, but actually when the Chaos Theory event launched this season, they actually changed it to a mid tier loot area. And if you're thinking how does Kings Canyon compare to Olympus in terms of high tier loot? Well actually Kings Canyon in theory has better loot than Olympus. You see Kings Canyon has around 16 high tier loot areas compared to only 10 on Olympus. So technically, Kings Canyon does have more high tier loot areas than Olympus. And maybe that's why it feels like third parties are way worse on Kings Canyon. It could be because there's more high tier loot areas in Kings Canyon and people just have better loot. I should say though, RNG is still a factor and it could well be other teams land in that same location and they get the high tier loot before you can get it. And that's just a sad fact of RNG in these kind of games. Now let's get into what are the actual best places to land and how you can make use of this to win more games in Apex Legends. In terms of mine and the Soggy Squad's favourite places to land, we like Runoff, Rig, Repulsor and Gauntlet. As you can tell, most of these areas are high tier loot areas. The only one that isn't is Gauntlet, but we like it there because the jump pads make it really easy to get around that area, so you can actually access loot quite quickly, making use of all the jump pads there. Now you can also use this map for yourself to gain an understanding of where the best loot is, and you can then be smart about where you want to drop. Now like me and the Soggy Squad, I would suggest you pick a handful of places that you like to drop, and try and make those purple zones on this map, just so you can make sure you get good loot. And I would recommend constantly dropping there until you get into the practice of knowing exactly where the loot spawns in certain buildings and where the best loot typically tends to be in those areas, because that means when you land, you can then go to the very specific place and you know exactly where all the loot is, which could definitely give you an advantage over other teams that drop there. And I'll give you an example of this. When we land in Runoff, Major Soggy tends to go to the top part of Runoff, General Soggy tends to take the ground floor, and then I tend to take the right side of the buildings. And this instinctive reaction means we're not stealing each other's loot, we're all getting good loot, and then we tend to group up in the middle, ready to take on other teams very quickly, typically before those other teams have even had time to loot themselves. You'll also notice that our favourite drop locations are spread around the map. This means whatever the direction of the dropship, there is always a place we can either hot drop or land late. And I'd recommend you do the same when you're choosing your handful of locations that you want to practice landing in. Pick purple locations around the map. Another great thing to use this map and knowledge for is actually how to rotate to the ring. So not just when you're landing and dropping, but also once you've landed, where do you rotate to get to the ring? Again, another example from me and the Soggy squad is when we land in runoff, we tend to either go through high desert or across to containment. As you can see, this means we get 3 high tier loot areas, usually by the end of the first ring. So typically we then have good loot to take on other teams. Of course, other teams will normally land in those locations as well, so it's also a good way to pick up some early kills. Overall though, I would say landing in a blue or grey area isn't bad by any means, but it just means you put yourself at a disadvantage if you're facing teams that are pushing in from these purple high tier loot areas. So you might as well give yourself the best advantage that you can and land in a purple high tier loot area to start with, because ultimately this will help you loot faster, and by looting faster, you can then rotate faster, and overall, this can definitely help you win more games in Apex Legends. I hope you found this video useful. Feel free to use this map as a reference next time you drop into Kings Canyon, and I've also uploaded it to my Instagram page as well, in case you want to go there and download it. I'll have lots of great Season 9 content coming, so don't forget to like and subscribe. Come join our community of friends. For now though, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.